Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies. Today we're going to be replacing the rear brake pads and rotors on this 2020 Chrysler Pacifica. We're actually just going to be doing this for video's sake, so I'm going to remove this pad and rotor set and put them back on. Hopefully you will be doing this because you need it and prior to getting metal to metal. We get started real fast like all my videos. Right there I took off the tensioner for the outboard pad on the outside of your caliper. Next we're going to remove the slider pins on the top side of the caliper. Got that top one and you got a bottom one right here. They're both under a dust grommet or a dust cap. You're going to take those off to get to the slider pins. There are 7mm hex drive to remove those. We also need to remove that bracket right there. To remove that bracket, I believe it's an 8mm on the backside of your rotor. To remove and to reinstall everything, I like to use a lug nut to hold, or two lug nuts, to hold on the rotor. During disassembly and reassembly, it's so much easier when your rotor's not flopping around on you. When it gets sideways, it jams everything, and both on the installation and the disassembly process. Here's that bracket that we're going to remove first. You can see the background. We were changing shops or garages at the time, I should say. So it was a complete mess. But this job is going to be real quick and easy. Make sure you stay tuned while you're here. Like, subscribe, and share. This video took me, I should say this job rather, this BJ took about an hour and 40 minutes or so to complete. If you were going to do this on your own, the pads and rotors cost, I would say, rotors themselves, end times change everything too. So I'd say at a shop you're about $400, $350 for this job. At home, usually less than $180 to $200. Now that we have that bracket off, just sitting there, remove your dust caps on the back side of your sliders. And again, a 7mm hex drive is going to remove your slider pins. It is important to properly tighten down your slider pins during the reinstallation process. I couldn't find the proper torque specs, but I will go over how tight I tighten everything more towards the end. And also, if you have like Mitchell or some type of car manual and you know the torque specs, I always recommend use torque specs when available. Now that you have your caliper all loose, take it off, take a good look at it, make sure you take visual note of how everything is on the caliper bracket, the rotor, while you're going along. I usually like to take pictures of everything if I'm not making a video of it like this, just so if I run into a problem when I'm putting everything back together, I have a visual aid of something rather than just being like, oh man, I hope I can find it online. I have everything at my fingertips. I use a bungee cord to hold my caliper up on the shock bracket or on the shock somehow right there. Just so it's out of the way, you don't want all the pressure on the wires and the hoses, just letting the caliper dangle right there. Removing your brake pads, make sure you take note of where your brake pads are positioned. On the inboard pad, it had that spring on top. On the outboard pad, you can see there's a slider on that bottom right of that pad. When you get a new pad set, make sure you get a pad set that has a wear indicator, of course, but also a hardware kit included if there's one available. That'll give you new sliders on the side, which this vehicle doesn't have from the factory, or new shims if they're available. With those shims, it eliminates the squeaking sometimes, and I prefer them. If you could put new ones on, put them on. To remove the caliper bracket, you will need a 18mm socket. I used a 3/8 drive and it seemed to get it off just fine. These shouldn't be too tight. On the rear on a smaller bracket like this, smaller caliper bracket like this, the torque spec is usually not that much. And again, when we go through the installation process at the end, I'll go over how tight I got everything without having the torque specs around. But I will update in the description of what the torque specs are as soon as they are available to me. Set your caliper bracket off to the side and the bolts that secure it. Make sure you don't ruin them or lose them. Now that we have everything off of the rotor, we can pull the rotor itself off. Take your two bolts that you're using to hold the rotor on, remove those, your rotor is going to slide right off. This is a floating rotor. It might be like gummed up or grimed up to the hub assembly, so it might take a couple whacks with a hammer. But if you're going to do that, make sure you don't damage the rotor if you're going to reuse it or get it turned. Rotors are so cheap these days, it's usually worth just to get new ones if it needs to be turned. If you need parts or tools used in this video, shown in this video, make sure you look for a link in the description below to purchase those. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share. Tell everybody about me. I try to make the fastest videos possible with the most information possible. I know it's not the best for me all the time, but hey, I know you guys like it because that's what I like. So let's get this bracket back on. Now that we have the rotor back on, or my new rotor on, depending on what we're doing or what you're doing. The rotor's on there being held with the lug nuts again during the reinstallation process, which makes it a lot easier in a step like this right here, where I am reinstalling the caliper bracket. If the rotor was wiggling around, this was already rough enough. If the rotor was moving around, it'd be harder to line everything up. I'm going to get these nice and snug for now, finger tight. Use a 3/8 drive to snug them up maybe. Now using a 3/8 drive torque wrench, I am going to tighten these bolts down to 70 foot-pounds. That's just seems about a good common torque spec on rear brakes, or rear caliper bracket, I should say. But again, that's just for myself. I would find the proper documentation of how to properly, or what the proper torque spec is on this, or also do some research on the importance of proper torque spec. Before we go too far, we need to loosen the cap on your brake fluid reservoir. We're going to compress the caliper soon, after we get everything torqued down properly on the caliper bracket, of course. Now we're going to reinstall the brake pads. Your inner brake pad had the spring on top. Your outboard pad had the little wear indicator on that lower left ear, it looked like, right there. So just get those setting in the caliper bracket. It was floating there. You could wait to put them on a little bit later after you do the caliper compressor if you like, but any fashion to do it, just get it in there. You can see this caliper compressor has these little keys that go on the compressor, so you could do multiple or different types of pistons, compress them. To get the caliper to compress on this vehicle, you must turn it while you're putting pressure inward. So that's what this little tool does. When you turn the top, the one with the handle, it will turn the plunger to turn your piston, which will push it back into the caliper. Hopefully you get all that. So this tool does it all for you. It's kind of a pain in the butt. It took a while to do this, but it gets it done. And doing something yourself, taking the time to do it, knowing how to do everything, you gain so much pride in your vehicle. You get so much pride in your ride. You get it? I tried to get you 2 angles, but I lost the other footage. It was kind of difficult to set this up, like I said. Time consuming, frustrating, but anything with the vehicle, as long as you take your time and have the patience, you could pretty much do anything on a vehicle other than take the engine out and put like new bearings in it or something. But just be patient, and it becomes easy. While you are compressing the caliper piston back into the caliper, that's a good time to take visual note. Make sure you don't have any rips on the boot or you see any visual brake fluid on your caliper itself. If you do, then you might need to do some other repairs or even just put a whole new caliper on, period. Now let's get everything lined up. But before we go too far, and I kind of forgot in this process or installation process, a very important piece of doing a proper brake job or doing a proper BJ is using the proper lube. I almost forgot. We need to lube the sliders. Liberally apply brake grease on the slider pins right here. If they're dirty or if you need to get any grime or anything off, make sure you do that now. You don't want anything causing the slider to not move back and forth. You want the caliper to move freely on your slider. You'll see at the very end, you're going to make sure everything moves, but you want everything to move very, very freely. Having the caps on your dust cover is a difference as well. That stops dust from getting onto these sliders, which would cause your caliper to get stuck sideways or just poor braking if you get a lot of dust. On this vehicle, when it came to me, the upper cap right there was missing. I made sure we ordered one after we got done with this job and put one in there just so this brake job lasts longer. Make sure you look for links in the description below to purchase parts and tools that you need, and tell everybody about me, please. If this video helps you out, make sure you let me know below in the comment section of the year, make, and model of the vehicle that this helped you on. Here you can see we're installing the slider pins into the caliper bracket. These do need to be torqued down, but again, I couldn't find the proper torque specs, and I'm going to use a common torque on these rear caliper brackets. And I torqued this one down to about 27 foot-pounds, I believe. Might be a little bit much, but it worked out just fine. Using a 3/8 drive and that 7mm hex, torque both slider pins down to 27 foot-pounds. Again, that's just a number that I like. That's not the actual specification. Do some research on the torque specs before you go break anything. Don't go too tight because you'll strip these bolts out. Get this dust cap on. If you have both, make sure you get both on. Next, you're going to need your caliper retaining spring. This went on fairly easy. I pushed down on the top of the caliper, which gave me some wiggle room with the spring, and it slid right on with no issues. Here, I'm just making sure that the teeth in the retaining spring are in the groove on that caliper. Here, this is where you want to see that your caliper is moving freely. You don't want anything hampering the movement. Don't go too far. You forgot the bracket, or you almost did. Using a 8mm socket, I lined up the bracket and tightened it down to my German torque specs of Gudentight. If I was going to use a torque wrench, I probably wouldn't put this more than 14 to 15 pounds small bolt like this. That's really weak. You don't want to over tighten. And after you get done with this, make sure you pump the brake pedal after you tighten your fluid reservoir. After you pump the brake pedal, make sure your fluid is at the full line, and you should be good to go when your pedal firms up. Other than that, everything is a go for you guys. Thanks for staying tuned throughout the whole thing. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share. Tell everybody about me, please. Maybe one of these two videos right here might help you out on your DIY maintenance journey. And I'll see you on the next hopefully helpful video. Thanks for watching Scotty's Hobbies.